President Trump launched a Twitter threat Sunday against Iran and the country's president, Hassan Rouhani. Rouhani had said a war with this nation would be, quote, mother of all wars. And President Trump shot back, writing, never, ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences, the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Zhang has a story.
Not at all.
President Trump this afternoon downplayed the escalation in tension between Washington and Tehran. The comments came after his tweet late yesterday addressing President Rouhani. Never ever threaten the United States again, he wrote, or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. The president was responding to remarks from Rouhani earlier that day. America should know that peace with Iran is the mother of all peace, and war with Iran is the mother of all wars. Rouhani's government has been under pressure as Iran's economy struggles. It is bracing for additional U.S. sanctions to take effect in 2 weeks, a consequence of President Trump's withdrawal from the Obama-era nuclear deal in May.
The United States no longer makes empty threats.
The Trump administration has taken a hard line with Iran, especially since the arrival of John Bolton as National Security Advisor and the elevation of Mike Pompeo to Secretary of State.
But I think everyone can agree that the regime in Iran has been a nightmare for the Iranian people.
Iran's leader blasted Pompeo for interfering in state matters. But Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said regime change is not the goal.
Again, our focus is on stopping Iran from having nuclear weapons, regardless of who is there. That's what our priority is.
Joining me now is CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Zhang. Weijia, good to see you.
You too, DeMarco. Great to be with you.
All right, the war of words seems to be escalating right now. On Monday, the foreign minister of Iran took to Twitter himself to respond, color us unimpressed. The world heard even harsher bluster a few months ago, and Iranians have heard them for 40 years. He ended his tweet the same way as President Trump did, with be cautious. Weijia, what is the White House hoping to accomplish with these exchanges here?
Well, we know that President Trump really values tough talk. It is one of his favorite tools when it comes to negotiation. And in the past, we've seen that it can actually lead to some results. For example, with North Korea, he used very similar language, as did Kim Jong-un. And eventually, it led to dialogue in that now pretty famous Singapore summit, of course. And so it's unclear whether that's what President Trump is trying to accomplish here, also to get President Rouhani of Iran to the negotiating table. In fact, Sarah Sanders, during the press briefing, was specifically asked multiple times, whether that was part of the strategy and what it would take to have direct negotiations between Presidents Trump and Rouhani. And she said she didn't want to get into any specifics or reveal what the president might be thinking in terms of his next move, but insisted that the main goal, the priority, is to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Ambassador John Bolton doubled down on the rhetoric today with a statement, quote, President Trump told me that if Iran does anything at all to the negative, they will pay a price like few countries have ever paid before. Do we know if President Trump consulted anyone before he sent his tweet? And does Bolton's statement signal a concerted effort by the administration?
The White House says that President Trump speaks with his security advisors on a daily basis. In fact, that is what officials responded with to answer that very question, whether they, especially John Bolton, was aware that the president was going to fire off this all-caps tweet directed at President Rouhani. And so that is the official statement, that they talk all the time. But it's interesting to look at the timing of when Bolton's statement was released. It was shortly after an impromptu press gathering with Sarah Sanders right here on the North Lawn, and that question came up, whether Bolton was aware of President Trump's tweet before he fired it off. And so minutes later, you have Bolton sending this message, this statement that, yes, in fact, I did speak with President Trump, and this is what we talked about. And he borrowed the exact language almost from the tweet to place into his statement to really show that he is behind the president. So whether it was before or after. The point here is that they are on the same page and that he supports the president's tough talk.
On Monday, you got a chance to ask Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders about President Trump banking on economic sanctions to get Iran back to the table after he pulled out of the Iran deal. Is that still the plan?
You know, DeMarco, that was a question when he pulled out, and that remains a question now. You know, when he abandoned the Iran nuclear deal, allies were extremely concerned, and they also wondered what his plan was as an alternate. And it seemed that really he was relying on these economic sanctions to be so tough that eventually Iran would have to cave and come back to the negotiating table. But a lot of experts were criticizing this as well, saying, you know, on the one hand, President Trump gets to rip up the agreement and say, I am holding Iran accountable, and I'm not going to accept terms that I, don't agree with. But on the other hand, he doesn't have a plan B to lay out and say, instead of the Iran nuclear deal, this is what I'm doing. And even though I asked that to Sanders today, she again did not directly answer, just committing to the administration's priority, which is to curb Iran's nuclear program.
Indeed, Sanders was asked whether the president was trying to change the subject from Russia to Iran, and here's what Sanders had to say.
No, I think the president has the ability, unlike a lot of those in the media, to actually focus on more than one issue at a time. And certainly we know that the media is obsessed with speaking about all Russia all the time, but the president's focused on a lot of things that are taking place across the globe, and Iran is one of them.
So a final question for you. How has the administration been handling the political blowback from Trump's meeting with Putin?
Well, you heard it right there in a soundbite. The main message is that, President Trump's meeting was a success. They made a lot of progress, and now they will tackle a lot of issues that have to do with the U.S. and Russia. The problem is that they're making these blanket declarations and claiming victory without providing any substantial details about agreements that were reached either formally or verbally. Today, actually, for the first time, I believe Sanders, responding to my question about that, said the only agreement that was reached was that they would continue their talks. Meanwhile, you have the Russian government saying that they are ready to implement agreements that the two leaders talked about. So we're getting two different stories, but from the White House, they are sticking to the president's message, which was he did what he went in there to do, and now he's going to continue that. But certainly it is frustrating because we don't have any details about their one-on-one conversation. We don't have what's called a readout, which is a sort of tick-tock of what they talked about. And we don't know whether these statements from President Trump, even to his advisors, are based on notes that he took, as in pen to paper, during that meeting, or just based on his memory. So there are still a lot of questions that we are not going to stop asking, and so far very little answers from the White House, except to say that it was a great meeting.
All right, Weijia Jiang at the White House. Always good to see you. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.